Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service El Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasoliti, president of El Monitor, and our guest this week is Steve Clemons, founding editor-at-large of Semafor, a new global news organization launching in October of this year. Steve is also the immediate past editor-at-large of The Hill, where he is now a contributing editor, and host of Al Jazeera English's Washington-based news show, The Bottom Line. Before joining The Hill, Clemons held senior editorial roles at The Atlantic, National Journal, and Quartz. He is proprietor of the popular political blog, The Washington Note, and had leadership roles at several Washington think tanks, including the New America Foundation, the Economic Strategy Institute, and the Nixon Center, now renamed the Center for the National Interest. Steve was also senior economic and international affairs advisor to Senator Jeff Bingaman. My conversation with Steve Clemons, one of the most insightful, engaging, and connected Washington columnists and journalists about U.S. politics and policy in the Middle East, begins now. Steve, welcome to On the Middle East.
My pleasure, Andrew. Great to be with you.
Great to have you with us. Let's start with an industry question. I can't resist.
Sure.
What can you tell us about Semafor? There's a lot of buzz out there about this new global media company. What can we expect, and how does it fit into the current media landscape?
Well, I can give you two parts to the answer. First, Semafor means signal for those who don't know the term, but I think many people in the military who've served in the military know it's an old naval signaling term. It's also a term used in the artificial intelligence arena as a term to distinguish true signal from false signal. And so, I think when you are out there, looking at this question of falsity and fabrication and posturing and social media driven news, we want to be the antithesis of that and to create essentially the best in standard journalism of major scale. So we plan to be global and plan to be deployed in Europe, Asia, Africa, Europe, et cetera. And I think that we will have some of the best people in the business that are developing the product. Now, we have 6 months or so before we'll be launching our new product. First product will probably be October 1st, the other suite of products around November. And I think in that process, you'll see a lot of things we do is high quality reported journalism. Axios solved the problem of how to digest a lot of news and deliver it to people in a manageable format. Their shtick is called smart brevity. We're not smart brevity. We're going to have highly reported news, but I think we're going to work on how we tell a story and anchor it in a greater commitment to reality and transparency than most have. So I know that that's a lot of gobbledygook to folks, but trust me, we're working hard on it and have people, but it would be a disservice to my colleagues to say more than that until we're out there right now. But I'm very, very excited about it. And as you know, you have Ben Smith as our editor-in-chief in the New York Times. Right. He was the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed. Justin Smith, who was the CEO of Bloomberg Global Media, and he was my CEO at The Atlantic. And we have Gina Chua, who is executive editor of Thomson Reuters. She's joined us as our executive editor. Caitlin Roman, of the chief product officer of The Athletic. Rachel Oppenheim, who is one of the chief revenue people at the New York Times, has just joined as our chief revenue. So the octane level of the people I'm working with is the best in this startup that I've ever had in my career.
And that's saying something. So, Steve, very much looking forward to Semafor launching in October. We'll be in touch about that. And thank you for the update on how's it going. Sure. It's a great team, great enterprise. Let's get into the substance here of what's happening in the news. The Russia-Ukraine war is recasting U.S. National Security. Defense Secretary Austin said this week that one objective is to weaken Russia so it can never do something like this again, that is, invade Ukraine. There seems to be bipartisan backing for a hard line on Russia and Putin, and in strong support of Zelensky in Ukraine. But let's get into the U.S. politics of this, because you have such a good feel on how the country is reacting and people in Washington are reacting, President Biden's approval ratings continue to go down despite widespread support for his policies in Ukraine. How do you see the politics of the Ukraine war, especially with congressional elections coming up in November? Or does it not matter what we're doing in Russia with regard to the other issues in American politics?
I think President Biden has a complex terrain to navigate. And he, since the withdrawal from Afghanistan and what appeared to many Americans to be extreme high consequence bungling of the American withdrawal there, whether people agreed we needed to be in Afghanistan or not, they largely do agree across party lines that it was a mess. And his popularity ratings, what I call Trump levels. So he's at Trump levels of popularity now, and it's been down there for a long time. And typically in a crisis like the Ukraine war, particularly with a country that was such an adversary during the Cold War with the United States and Soviet Union, you would imagine there would be a bump up. I heard, former Defense Secretary Robert Gates just the other night, praising President Biden and the administration for both the efforts they've made in sending the right signals to Russia, of being strong, of supporting Zelensky and the Ukrainians, but also showing restraint and doing that. And that's a rare thing, because Bob Gates, as you know, is very, very critical of Joe Biden and said he had never made a foreign policy decision that he agreed with in the past. But so that was a very interesting moment. But he also said that what is missing right now is that President Biden is not taking this moment where you see people dying in the streets, dying in fighting for their liberty, fighting for democracy, fighting for their lives against an invader of a sovereign nation. And he's not taking this moment to explain to Americans why Ukraine matters so much to America, why being engaged in global affairs matters so much to America. And this gets to a deeper issue in the numbers you're looking at, that there remains a fatigue in America and a sense that being engaged globally has not worked out to the benefit of many, many Americans, that whether it was trade deals, whether it was, serving, in multiple lines of terms of duty in Afghanistan or Iraq, that somehow the quid pro quo that the average American family felt by America playing that role of global security guarantor in the world was no longer benefiting them, that they had fought the Cold War a generation ago and China had won. And so this notion of this disconnect between American engagement in the world and what Americans get in return from the world is right now broken in my book. And it's why I think you see flat numbers, even in this moment of high crisis and high tension and riveting heroic stories in Ukraine. The fact is, Washington and the strategic class may be applauding the unity in NATO and the newfound purpose for America's place in the world, et cetera. But a lot of Americans aren't there. And I think that's one of the reasons why Joe Biden is not in the 60s and he's down in the low 40s.
It's a very interesting analysis. I'd like to take it one step further and kind of bring in the Middle East. During the campaign, the 2020 campaign, I wrote a piece looking back at Biden's position on Iraq. And as you know, I was with Chuck Hagel at the time during the Iraq War. And Senators Biden, Lugar, and Hagel tried to offer at the time an alternative resolution to the one that the leadership in the Congress was putting forward, that had more conditionality with regard to diplomacy in the second UN resolution and a number of other things. It could not get out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee because 3 Democrats were just a hard no: Wellstone, Boxer, and Feingold. And on the Republican side, Link Chafee, even for a compromise resolution supported by Biden, Hagel, and Lugar to counter, what Warner and McCain and the others were putting forward. Are you surprised at all at the absence of kind of what we might call anti-war voices in the Democrat Party at this time, and that the unanimity of the strategic class and the political class, at least in terms of the Congress, is so strong behind the president?
I am, Andrew. I sort of think we're in this period of time where there's an inchoateness in strategic thought. You used to have defined schools, and for a quick tour through this, we had neoconservatives on the right, and we had liberal internationalists on the left, but all well-meaning people who, I look at as patriots who care about the country. But to be blunt, they tend to, both for various reasons and drivers, believe in the deployment of American power to either secure democracy, secure human rights, a values-based driven militancy in the world. And both the right and the left congealed around a lot of these issues. But there was a school, U.S. foreign policy, as you know, Andrew, and Senator Hagel was part of this school, had a long line of realist thinkers who said, at the end of the day, we want to do good things in the world as a great nation, as a steward of security, as a superpower, but we want to be able to steward our resources that we can fight another day, that we're there. And it is really your future position that gives you the premium of power that other nations respect or fear or work with. And so that realism was always a balance to this. I can't tell who the realists are anymore. I can't even see if they're there. I know Bill Burns, who's director of the CIA, is a hardcore realist, but I'm not sure where everyone else is in this. And it seems like we've gotten swept into, I think, a careless kind of willingness to be for semi-war. Now, I don't think anybody is advocating that we go to war with Russia, but we're going to close war to Russia. And if you basically look at the world of gray conflict and hybrid conflict today and how maybe we're at war with Russia right now. Maybe we've been more at war with China right now. It's very hard. One of the big nightmares I have about national security questions is whether we are caught like the British were doing during the American Revolutionary War. The British were well organized, regimented, well outformed and uniformed, lots of codes in how they operated. And the Americans were in the woods and marshes and swamps, fighting them, the militias. And today it seems like other nations like Russia, as we've seen with little green men in Ukraine, in Crimea, as you see with China and cyber activities, et cetera, the dimensions of conflict have changed so dramatically that I don't know if war and conflict, as we kind of typically classify them, are the things we should be looking at. There are many other dimensions to that today. And so I think it makes it easy for a senator or for a Democrat, for Republicans or everything, to sort of be for, a vigilant reaction. But we used to talk, Andrew, about deterrence, what it took to shore up deterrence, what readiness was. This whole kind of conversation seems to be pushed to the sidelines while people posture one way or another without having to look, at the ecosystem of commitment when it comes to a conflict and either being engaged in it or not. I know that's long-winded, but I do think that right now it's very surprising that calculating realism about American national security interests and making sure we stay on the right side of that line and not get overextended is in thin supply right now in the U.S. Congress.
A great point, Steve, and really well said. I mean, in understanding the fluidity between diplomacy, which is about engagement and not about giving things away, and deterrence, and how that comes together, especially in this new hybrid world of threats that you laid out so well. Well said. Steve, you and I were in Doha together last month, and you were in touch with the leaders in Washington and abroad, and they talked to you. And tell us, based upon your conversations in Qatar, in the Middle East more broadly, with Middle Eastern leaders here in Washington and those passing through, you come across, what, if anything, is the mainstream media and strategic class here in Washington missing about the Middle East? How is the region seeing Washington and the United States, and what are they saying about us, including and especially this Russia-Ukraine war? And even more broadly, our relationship and contest and competitive relationship with China?
Look, there's a formalism in foreign affairs that people on stage and people in meetings and people in classrooms and on news lines that have official roles often don't critique the United States because it's an important ally and partner, and so many of the nations there believe and want America to do well and to be perceived as strong and capable. But there is an informal reality that all of them have to prepare for and simulate for, which is during the Trump administration in the era of America First, which popped its head up at that time, but still remains with us and a significant number of Americans, but also in the strategic cautiousness of Barack Obama, the strategic contraction as perceived in some of the things that President Biden has done. There is a sense that America's rolling back some of its presence, its commitment in the various parts of the world. And even when President Biden came out and sent his defense secretary, sent his Secretary of State and his national security advisor to wrestle with China in the so-called pivot to Asia, that was read by a lot of parts of the world. Where pivoting to Asia, we're putting a lot of resources there, more platforms and attention. We're going to send folks there, but sorry, the rest of the world, we're busy. And so it made America look weaker and less dependable. And I've often said, if you want to measure the way America is perceived in the world, its footprint, don't look at our enemies like North Korea, or I would say Iran, or rivals, I should say. Look at our allies. And I wrote a piece a long time ago. I mean, it preceded this period of time, it preceded Donald Trump. I said, look at Japan, look at Germany. So two huge allies of the United States that we had beaten in World War II, that became anchors of our relationship and stability in their various theaters. Look at Saudi Arabia and Israel, both of whom were two. And you can look and you just begin to measure how they began to behave differently than they would have otherwise in an era where America was uncontested, maybe except in the Cold War with the Soviets, but it was just so robustly engaged everywhere in the world. They had strong confidence that America would be with them in their dark days. I think that has deteriorated significantly. And all these other nations in the world are trying to help us, trying to be there, but they don't believe that we will fully be there. So you see cases like the UAE has actually been an agent of Russia coming into places like Libya and Egypt. UAE is a very close ally of the United States, but it's not depending only on the United States. You have, other areas in the Middle East. You have Qatar, which came to American support and rescue, if you will, in the withdrawal from Afghanistan, playing a huge role, as the UAE also did, by the way, in massive airlift of people out, but also taking over key institutions and playing the role of being interlocutor with the Taliban for us. But that creates burdens for others out there. So America has allies and friends, but it's just a different relationship where the relative weight of America is in decline. And you see other nations like China and Russia. If you go over and have a frank conversation in the Middle East, they will tell you Russia is much more present. Now, this is pre-Ukraine invasion, but even in places like the UAE, Russia continues to be a very big presence and a very big, mover of the needles there. But I think that China and other nations are now, in a world that is no longer indisputably under the influence of a single superpower. You see the diversity of power and the different currents of power very actively in the Middle East. And I think there's a lament, frankly, and I felt it when we were in Doha, a lament that America seems to be on crutches, doesn't seem to be able to do all the kinds of things it was going to do, that is somehow doubted. And I think that's a problem. And I think it's because, in my view, we got overextended in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And we saw the mystique of America's superpower status in the world punctured. And when you're, I tell you, being a superpower is not all, missiles and tanks and ships. It's also the strength and vitality of your economy. And it's not having a, 2008, 2009 financial crisis with structural corruption in your economy. And so these kinds of things have added up to create big question marks and doubts about the United States. And if I were advising the president, advising our nation's leaders, I would say the first thing we need to do is do far more to correct those problems. And that's not necessarily a military function. It's a diplomatic, it's a political, and it's even an economic one, because China's power comes as much, if not more, from things like the Belt and Road Initiative than they do from the size of China's growing military.
Steve, there have been a number of articles recently about the problems in the U.S.-Saudi relationship, and these ties have been a bedrock of U.S. policy in the Gulf. And the U.S. started to have issues with the kingdom after 9/11, then over the Arab Peace Initiative, the Iraq War. But now it seems the strains are quite severe. What's your take? Is it better or worse than reported? Are they solvable problems? How do you see it?
Look, we're going to be, I remember when John Kerry was our Secretary of State, Joe Biden was our Vice President. I won't put words in their mouths, but the, various people was meeting to in that administration at the time. We're increasingly looking at Iran, which was a complicated rival power in which we were trying to do a joint deal around the future of its nuclear energy program, and came up with the JCPOA, this Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And in that process, we had various skirmishes and tensions with Iran that got solved. And to a certain degree, a camaraderie, if you will, I shouldn't call it camaraderie, but a comfortableness that Iran kind of became a more comfortable rival at the same time that Saudi Arabia became a very uncomfortable ally. And I think that that uncomfortable ally status of the Saudis, which became very aggravated and hit, one of its key points with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and the aftermath of that, and whatnot, and the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince currently, is one that we're faced in a situation. This is where realism takes hold, where you can't be in conflict right now with all of the world's great oil and energy producers. It's a fundamental core necessity, but it also means you've got to get back to managing complex relationships where you can challenge Mohammed bin Salman for some of the things that he has done that have been horrible and ruthless, and deal with them in one way, constructively, and try to punish or have it. And we used to do this with the Soviet Union. We would have 13 different tracks with the Soviets. If 2 or 3 of them blew up, we'd have 8 or 9 others, whether it was food trade or whatever, arms control. And I think that with some of these powers that have become complicated and are clearly not going to become, to quote Tom Friedman, they're not going to become more like us than, although he did write one time that everybody was becoming more like us. It's just simply not the fact. That we've got to find a way to not ascribe and to think that we will be transformative in the culture and decision making and behavior of all these countries, but we have core national security interests that do matter. So Saudi Arabia is a vital nation that is more our ally and supporter, though complex and problematic, and it plays across the line sometimes. But overall, it's been with us far more than it's been against us. And that's the opposite of Iran. So what you want to do is try to keep the Saudis on one side of the line while you're trying to find a different future forward with Iran. And part of the problem is that the Iran-Saudi relationship is kind of like the Pakistan-India relationship. They're at each other's throats, and they're each other's strategic rivals in the region. And the U.S. has diminishing capacity, or perceived diminishing capacity, in these relationships. And that's a real big security risk. I mean, you and I have both been in Pentagon simulations before, where they look at Pakistan and India as one of the most likely places for thermonuclear exchange. I would say if you wait 20 years and we don't keep nuclear proliferation bottled up, the Saudis and the Iranians will be in the same situation as the Indians and the Pakistanis. So I think in that, I know it's hard for people to hear, we cannot walk away from the Saudis, but that doesn't mean we have to acquiesce and hug them either, and bless Mohammed bin Salman's economic plans, and he would like to tie it all together in a neat ribbon and stop being criticized. Absolutely not. But at the same time, we can't walk away from the reality that they are a key energy partner, and also a key ally, where more of their security interests overlap with ours than not.
Absolutely right, Steve. And let's not forget the war in Yemen, which cannot come to a close without a very close partnership and coordination. And hopefully we see some positive signs there. Let's turn to Iran. Now, the Iran nuclear deal may have a pulse. It's a faint pulse at this point.
Yeah, I thought it was almost back.
Yeah,
it's almost like the reborn creature, come back.
Yeah, I think we had a piece a while back, and that said something like, what you need to know about the Iran nuclear deal. We were all on call that weekend, ready in Vienna, but didn't happen. And we know the issues. One is regarding designation, or lifting the designation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization. Do you see this agreement as a must-have for the Biden administration. Again, getting into the politics of it a bit, this was a priority when President Biden came into office. He appointed an envoy. He had said during the campaign that Trump made a major mistake in withdrawing from the deal. Things have gotten worse with regard to Iran's nuclear capabilities since then. The administration regularly points this out. And now the talks are stalled. What do you see happening in terms of the administration? How long can they wait for Iran? And as we've written many times over the past year or so, there's not going to be a lot of congressional support for an Iran nuclear deal as compared to what we were talking about earlier with regard to U.S. policy toward Russia and Ukraine.
Right. Well, I see several things. I see that this deal is not moving forward right now because Iran doesn't want the deal, that Iran doesn't sense that Joe Biden's administration is as powerful as it might otherwise be. If Joe Biden were, as I said, in the 60%, if we saw America resurging around the world in various ways, I think this deal would have been done by now. I think the measure of the complaint about the IRGC, while maybe deep, and the IRGC is a significant institutional reality inside Iran, as you know, I don't believe that its designation one way or another would be disqualifying for the supreme leader in Iran to have come on board if other factors were in place. So they don't want the deal is part of this, because they don't feel that like the U.S. Can push it, forward. So it's willing to bide its time. That said, and I think it's another measure, in the eyes of the world that Joe Biden is not a robust, muscular president. So, which is unfortunate. I wish it were the other way. It's not what I see or advocate. It's just the way I see it right now. So that's part one. Part two is, I think that I buy the line that came from President Obama that Iran and its nuclear program were on track to create enough nuclear material, potentially enough nuclear warheads, combined with a ballistic missile program that could become regionally destabilizing, start an arms race, and lead to, what many would call for as a call for military action against Iran, either by Israeli taking that action. And if they did take that action on their own, which is very hard to imagine, but they could take that, they would be making a strategic choice for their key ally and stalwart support of the United States. And I've always been worried that if Israel made that strategic choice for the United States, there would be enormous fallout in the long run in the U.S.-Israel relationship, which might not be, a healthy thing. But let's just take it that because I haven't seen the intelligence and I don't know, but let's just say I buy the line that Iran is on that course, if not constrained by the JCPOA, in a deal that Iran was going to see its economic fortunes rise, that it was going to see investment in the nation rise and allow an end to the various layered sanctions against the regime and help bring a higher quality of life to Iranians. So I think that was, really essentially what, the key elements of the deal were. But if that doesn't happen, then you've got the Iranians have made enormous gains in their nuclear program after Donald Trump, pulled out of the course. It was the U.S. that abrogated the deal, not the Iranians. And so in that situation, they have made enormous progress. You can't unlearn, you can't unthink, they've got the design capacity. So you're in a situation now that I think is more unstable than people may realize, because it's whether people think in terms of, okay, how many widgets have they made? How many warheads they've made? It's the question that the knowledge and infrastructure can exist. Nations can eventually hide things that they want to. And you have now created a world of blurred uncertainty, around a weapon of mass destruction in the region, and created increased anxieties, which I think is very unfortunate. So, I guess in my view, whether it's President Biden, if he comes back another term, whether it's President Trump or whatever Republican comes out, in the next term, someone's going to be facing that military question of whether they take a preemptive strike or a reactionary strike against, Iran's nuclear activities. It could have incredibly unpredictable consequences for all players in that war in the region. So I think that that's the future we have to think of, that we're casually let happen because the IRGC issue is out there and neither side can get around it. You have to begin thinking about the nightmare that lies ahead to understand how small and stupid the current barrier is. And so when we get to that point of real conflict down the road, they're going to look back and say, why were we such idiots at that moment? But the truth is, we're all being idiots about it. There's not, a sense of consequence. And I completely agree with you that if this had to go through the U.S. Senate, they would never get approval. All they would do is try to, I was talking to Rob Malley, who's our envoy on this, and said, all they really need is to keep a filibuster from happening against them, and they will get through. So I think that's an interesting way to do it. You basically need 41 votes, as you know. You don't need 50. So.
Exactly. Steve, we're running out of time, but I've
Yeah.
got to ask you this. We've known each other, I think, for almost 20 years or more than 20 years, back when you were senior policy advisor to Senator Jeff Bingaman, a Democrat. I was Senator Chuck Hagel's foreign policy advisor. He's a Republican. Many members at that time, Republican and Democrat, congealed around the center or its near orbit. You stay close to many of the politics and the players here in Washington, and you keep up that spirit of collegiality and engagement, including those you may disagree with. I really admire that. Are you hopeful that that spirit and tone that we worked in on the Hill those decades ago can take hold again?
I am. I mean, I don't want to sound like Pollyannish or naive, but I'm too riveted into decisions that unfortunately much of the nation doesn't see, where you'll be at a dinner and hear Democratic members of Congress, House and Senate both, confessing their desire to get things done, talking across the table, with Republican senators who want to do this. And there are real differences and changes. I interviewed Senator Kevin Cramer. He happened to vote against Ketanji Brown Jackson, but in my interview, he said there is absolutely nothing wrong for President Biden to say that we need to have a Black woman on the Supreme Court. So here's a very conservative senator from North Dakota saying something. He says, I'm gonna get in trouble with this, but he says, I believe that because we need a Supreme Court that looks like America. Or he said, I've got a company in my district that makes GE wind blades for the big windmills in the wind industry. And this isn't a fossil fuel guy. So there are things out there if people are creative, and to find that there's much more complexity in them. When Joe Manchin was just savaged in the New York Times in something where they're talking about his energy portfolio, et cetera, saying he's never done anything on climate. Well, to with all due respect, don't want to defend him. He can defend himself. But if you look at what the Energy Committee has done, or what he put together as a not picked up $1.8 trillion alternative to Build Back Better, this is the week it blew up. So when he was talking with President Biden the week the Build Back Better plan blew up, he gave him a $1.8 trillion. Everybody's saying, damn it, we should have grabbed the Manchin plan, which was packed with climate provisions. So the tendency, and Andrew, I despise the overstatement, the posturing, the obfuscation and the fabrication in the news media today. Let's call things as they are. Joe Manchin is clearly much more focused on the fossil sector he says for energy and national security reasons, but he's not hostile to other areas in renewable. So, that's one area of this. But when you find in the space, whether it's national security, whether it's talking about infrastructure, which had a group of Republican and Democratic senators and House members that came together to push that through, I think that, Manchin and Lindsey Graham and Kevin Cramer and Shelley Moore Capito and others are going to come together, Chris Coons, and they're going to do a bipartisan climate energy bill here pretty soon, and hatch that in the Senate, put the deal together. Hopefully the White House comes on board. So you see it coming back in places, And so I'm hoping that these green shoots are something that takes hold over a period of time. Now, may be naive that that's not where the political base of these various parties are in the primaries, but I just see too much bipartisan goodwill in this town that's in the closet. I hope someday it can come out of the closet.
Let's hope so. Steve, this was a treat. Always enjoy spending time and talking with you. Thank you for joining us today on the Middle East.
My pleasure, Andrew. Thank you so much.
We will be back after this short break.
I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's audio series On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amber Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can now watch our newest video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts along with first-class reporting and analysis.
Thanks to our guest, Steve Clemons, and to our production team of Beowulf Rockland and Rosabelle Hine of Two Squared Media Productions. We will be back next week, and if you haven't done so, please sign up for all 3 Al Monitor podcasts at your favorite podcast platform. Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. Gilles' guest this month is Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Orhan Pamuk. On Israel with Ben Caspit, where Ben's guest this week is Israeli cybermaster Nadav Safrir. And of course, this podcast on the Middle East, where I will be here next week with another decision maker or thought leader in the region. Thank you all for listening, and please keep up with all of the news and trends in the Middle East at almonitor.com.